We are going to get started as it is 1:01. And so I want to welcome everybody today to our annual Refugee Mental Health Stakeholder Conference. Thank you all for joining us. We are so excited to have you all here today. And to start us off, my name is Morgan Hoffman. I am the project coordinator for our SAMHSA Stakeholder Project at the Research Program on Children and Adversity. I've also been working with the Boston Children's Trauma and Community Resilience Center to plan this workshop. And again, I want to thank you all for joining our annual Refugee Mental Health Stakeholder Workshop. Our theme this year is Revitalizing Systems of Care, promoting refugee children's mental health and belonging. And although we would love to see you all in person, holding this workshop over Zoom allows for our attendance from folks all over the United States. And so today we will have the great pleasure of uplifting voices from policymakers and clinicians working within the current refugee resettlement landscape in the US. And you all should have received a digital welcome packet via email this morning, which we hope will be helpful for you today for networking down the road with other attendees and panelists, and all individuals with a passion for improving the well-being of refugees. And so as people are still signing into the Zoom, we're going to begin with a warm-up and learn more about those in the room. And so we'll be starting a poll shortly, and your responses are anonymous to the poll, and we'll only be sharing back the summary information. But before we do so, I want to go more over the agenda today. So Jamie, can you hit next slide? I also wanted to note that this event will be recorded. So great. So as I mentioned, the first 10 minutes we'll be spending on Zoom arrival and an icebreaker, which I'll be launching the poll in just a few minutes. And then we'll be having opening remarks from Jeff Winner and Teresa Betancourt. And then we'll move into our two panels, which will have our community and providers panel, following a 15-minute Q&A. And for the Q&As, we are asking all attendees to, if they would like, post their questions in the chat. I wanted to make a note that if you submit your questions in the chat, everyone in the Zoom webinar is able to see those questions. And if you want to send it more privately, you can send it using the Q&A function. And that way only speakers and the facilitators on our end will be able to see it. And although we would love to be able to answer everyone's questions, we're going to try to do our best in the short time to get people's questions addressed. So please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will be monitoring the chat during the Q&A section. And then following our second panel, we'll also be having a short share back and takeaways through this great activity called Padlet. And then we'll be wrapping up with our summary and closing. So that is our packed agenda for today. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jeff, who will be launching and going through our poll.
Great. Thanks so much, Morgan. So we're going to launch a quick poll just as a warm-up. A couple of important questions as we build community together. And again, thanks everyone for being here. Again, I'm Jeff Winner. I'm one of the psychologists from the Trauma and Community Resilience Center. So these are submitted anonymously. What kind of food do you like best? Spicy, sweet, savory, or salty? What kind of art do you like to have in your workspace? Photographs, paintings, or sculptures? And what industry or lens will you use for approaching today's stakeholder workshop from? So we'll seeing the polls very active, lots of moving bars. If we can get to around 75, 80%, then we'll close it. We're right around 60%, neck and neck with a couple of these. Again, what kind of food do you like best? Question one, what kind of art do you like to have in your workspace? And what industry or lens will you be using to approach today's stakeholder workshop? So they have another 10 seconds, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we're going to end the poll. See where we're at. We're right around 90%. Let's share the results and see where we're at. So we've got, I think we've got Savory coming in the lead, 46%, although solid representation across those 4 S's. Photographs and paintings, sorry, sculptures are strong in the 50% with art in your workspace. And then we've got folks from all different spaces: mental health provider, policymaker, research academic, social service, or something else. Awesome. So it's great to have this diverse community here today. And we can move on to the next slide. So I'll be presenting our slides today. Heidi Ellis, my colleague, unfortunately isn't here at the beginning. Family's navigating a COVID situation. Heidi will be here later, so she sends her regards. And I'll be saying a little bit about our program at Boston Children's Hospital. So we're the Trauma and Community Resilience Center, dedicated to understanding and promoting the healthy adjustment of youth and families who've experienced adversity. And in partnership with communities and service systems, we build prevention and intervention programs, conduct research, and develop resources to assist families and service providers. And we have 3 areas of programming at our center: refugee and immigrant trauma and resilience, multidisciplinary models of violence prevention, and global health. And today we'll be highlighting our refugee and immigrant work. Our flagship program from our center is called Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees. It's an adaptation of trauma systems therapy, which is a behavioral health, organizational, and psychotherapy model developed by Heidi Ellis and our colleague Glenn Sachs, who's now at NYU a number of years ago. And TSTR, that adaptation, is a systems-oriented, phase-based trauma and culture responsive program for refugee, immigrant youth and families. And we're really fortunate through our NCTSN funding to work as model developers, trainers, and consultants, and also work directly with folks implementing this model. Currently, there's more than 10 implementation programs throughout the United States and around the world. Many of them are listed here, and a number of those colleagues are here in the room today. And we're incredibly fortunate to work with so many amazing people trying to uplift the quality of care for refugee and immigrant kids and families from refugee and immigrant backgrounds. Part of our NCTSN Category 2 funding gives us the amazing opportunity to continue to develop TSTR and other resources. So I'll highlight a couple of those now. That first one was a training video, which we started to develop last year. My colleagues Luna Mulder and Amy Pepiora have led that, and we launched that in January of this year with professional actors doing TSTR training programs. This slide here is a best practice series that we launched last year for mental health providers in year 1, and we're developing that and launching it for law enforcement officials in year 2. Next slide. We also have our refugee and immigrant core stressors toolkit, which many of you may be familiar with. You can find a blue button above some of our heads on our main landing page of our website. This highlights the 4 core stressors framework, common areas of strength and struggle for refugee and immigrant youth. It's currently been used by around 6,000 providers around the world, and we're currently developing a school-based assessment tool that builds upon that. In our Cat 2, we also have 2 new stakeholder meetings, which have been really fun and really meaningful. And we've launched the TSTR Implementation Science and Practice Advisory Board, which Luna Mulder and myself run. And then the National Community Advisory Board, which is embedded within that first board that Alicia Miller and Luna Mulder run. The goal of that is to uplift the voices of folks doing the work of TSTR to the integration of the model, so we can support dissemination, adaptation, and sustainable implementation. And so that's been a lot of fun. That's a photo from one of our past meetings. And then a shout out to Alicia Miller and our colleagues who've been leading an NCTSN Category 3 implementation of trauma systems therapy for refugees here at Boston Children's Hospital. That's a photo of the team where they're implementing TSTR based at BCH for folks in the Boston area, primarily ethnocultural minorities and refugee and immigrant groups from Boston, specifically folks from Central American and Mexican backgrounds. So that's been an amazing program we're excited about. And I have very high job satisfaction, in part because I get to work with amazing, very smart, very dedicated people on a team. Refugee and immigrant mental health is a team sport. And so these are some photos from various folks from our team in Boston. And with that, I'll pass it over to our colleague, Teresa Bencourt. To you, Teresa.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thanks everyone for being here. It's really exciting to see in the chat all the places around the world that we have represented today. So it's just an honor to do the stakeholder meeting every year, and thanks for being present. So to tell you just briefly about the research program on children in adversity, or the RPCA, We're an applied research group that is really dedicated to understanding factors that contribute to more risky or more resilient life outcomes in children and families that face adversity. We take a strengths-based focus in doing this, and we've worked for a very long time on topics of children affected by armed conflict, also HIV and AIDS, and refugee displacement. We're very interested in closing this gap between what we know about the science of early adversity and its impact on child mental health and development, and to really see the highest quality programs delivered in very low resource settings, including in the United States. So we have an amazing team. I won't be able to go into detail. This is just from our refugee team. I want to give a major shout out to our collaborators at the Maine Immigrant and Refugee Services, as well as REAC, the Refugee Immigrant and Assistance Center here in Boston. And then just to give you an overview of our implementation science and our observational research, we've worked on just observational and intervention development research 20 years in war-affected settings like Sierra Leone. We've also worked in Ethiopia, Northern Uganda, Russian Federation, Mexico, and Thailand. We've had a very large grant from the National Institutes of Mental Health studying the collaborative team approach to scaling a group mental health intervention linked to employment and education programs in West Africa. And we're continuing on that thread of implementation science in our global work, also related to family-based prevention and violence reduction. Our work in Rwanda is really taking this with a focus on early childhood development and violence reduction with a family strengthening intervention that there is called Sugira Moyango. We've been scaling and testing a strategy for scaling across 3 districts in Rwanda and have reached 10,000 families in extreme poverty there. And in our work in the United States, we're really focused on resettling families, and I'm going to focus in on that today, and that National Institutes of Minority Health research that has supported the development of a family strengthening intervention done by refugees for refugees. So just to give you a little more detail about this work, we've had 2 grants from the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities. Our early work started with Somali Bantu refugees in Chelsea and then eventually in the broader Boston area. And then we extended that to this question of, can we work with multiple cultural groups with one core model if the model is delivered by people who come from that background, who speak that language, who have that cultural shared experience with the families that they're working with. And we did this through community-based participatory research involving community advisory boards, youth advisory boards, and we published the results of a trial with both Bhutanese and Somali Bantu families. And through COVID, we're finishing a very large randomized controlled trial, which is just being analyzed now with good results. And this has led us to now look at an adaptation with Afghan families, which we're doing with Maine Immigrant and Refugee Services in the greater Lewiston, Portland area with support from W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Now, a part of getting to that was doing a needs assessment when resettling Afghan families were coming first to the United States. Working with USCRI and ORR, we were able to work at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, using some of the same community-based participatory research methods to get at what are non-stigmatizing terms we can use for talking about mental health issues related to children and adolescents. We'd published this with Somali Bantu and Bhutanese, and now we wanted to recreate those methods, first starting at Fort McCoy. And now we're actually doing this with resettled families in the greater Boston area. So training local Afghans to go out, ask about the problems of youth, really dig deep into problems of thinking, feeling, relationship, and try to get at appropriate terms for talking about some of those problem domains. With this, we hope to equip providers with language for talking about mental health and mental health promotion. And with IRC Switchboard in this partnership, we'll be developing national webinars, downloadable resources, and tools to support ORR-funded refugee service providers in the United States. We also, because we want to get to an ultimately very flexible model for family-based prevention done by non-specialists from that same background, we're looking at a digital app now that is used by the home visitor that can quickly switch between different cultural groups. We can load new imagery, new language in there. We're doing user interface, user experience testing in co-design groups with different cultural populations and our experienced interventionists to test out this new platform. And we hope in the years ahead, it will help us with strategies for getting to greater scale. And just in that dream of greater scale, you see the amazing work that TSTR has done. We're really earlier in just focusing on, do these methods work? We've tested it across 3 cultures, ensuring quality, fidelity, and competence of home visitors, making sure that we have good risk of harm protocols, that we're developing these tools for supporting the home visitor, and then a real focus on methods for training and capacity building, establishing a seed team that can be flexible, that can even work across different states as we have interest. We have a very exciting planning in Michigan, where we're hoping to do a training this spring, taking some of our experienced team members out there to train through role play-based learning, new facilitators in new states. And then our goal, much like you see with TSTR, is get to a multi-state learning collaborative where we really have a community of practice in this evidence-based family home visiting intervention to promote child mental health. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to talking about our greater stakeholder event and the first panel today. So I'd like to introduce Laura Bond, who's a PhD candidate and doctoral researcher with our program. Laura has a master's in international peace and conflict resolution from American University. And before traveling through India and Africa through her work with Catholic Relief Services, she had worked on a number of programs funded by the US government in refugee resettlement. And most recently, she's been doing some exciting consulting work with us in Sesame Workshop. So I just want to turn it over to Laura to take over the first panel. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Teresa. And I still think that a couple of our panelists for this first panel are trying to join the Zoom, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce them all anyway. So I'm so pleased to introduce Beth Farmer, Dr. Hawthorne Smith, Hannah Lasso, and Karubo Webster. Beth Farmer is a licensed clinical social worker and the director of the Safety, Education, and Wellness Technical Unit of the International Rescue Committee. Beth is a recognized leader in mental health for the displaced people and most notably spearheaded the movement to create a validated mental health screening tool for refugees in the United States, which is now being used in 7 different countries. Dr. Hawthorne Smith is a licensed psychologist and serves as the president of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs, as well as an assistant clinical professor at NYU's School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. As a co-founding member of Nawayon Incorporated and coordinator of the International Youth Leadership Institute, Dr. Smith has worked with refugees from Sierra Leone, as well as displaced Africans in New York and marginalized New York City teenagers. Hannah Lasso is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at the University of Vermont and TSTR provider. Her research interests include improving family, community, and school environments to better celebrate and protect gender expansive youth. Hannah is trained in the Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees method. Hannah's grateful to be a part of this work, as well as the opportunity to work with amazing and resilient refugee youth and their caregivers. And Karubo Webster is a case manager, women's group coordinator, and TSTR provider at the Association of Africans Living in Vermont in Burlington. She uses the Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees method in her work and is passionate about representation among marginalized groups that have been deeply impacted by inadequate social structures. All right, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists now.
Thank you so much. Laura, I didn't know if I know that there were certain questions. Did you want us to read the question first and then respond?
Oh yeah, so let me start you out with that. So this first question is for Beth. So I'm going to start with you, Beth, and then go around and ask the rest of the panelists to if they want to contribute anything as well. So after systems were decimated under the prior US administration, what are the big services challenges as you see them in responding to the current new displaced populations, including Afghans, Venezuelans, and Ukrainians?
Thanks so much. Definitely within refugee resettlement under the last administration, things were very much hollowed out. I think it's also important to note that during COVID as well, that many of the mental health systems became very stretched and stressed. And then as COVID has also started to wane, that those systems still remain stretched and stressed, and there is not enough slots or enough capacity for people, period, much less refugee, immigrants, and migrants. I'll also say that other things have really impacted the forcibly displaced population during the past administration and COVID, which includes the Remain in Mexico or so-called migrant protection protocols, which have kept people out of the US, as well as Title 42 with the public health emergency, which means that many people who are needing care and support are trapped along the border, and not only just trapped along the border, that they're experiencing significant violent events and traumatic events because of where they are, including kidnappings, sexual assault, feeling that they must send their kids on their own as unaccompanied children. So I would say that in many ways, there's kind of been a perfect storm of things, as well as the many wonderful new innovations within humanitarian programs with Afghan humanitarian parole, Ukrainian humanitarian parole, Venezuelan humanitarian parole, Cuban humanitarian parole, but also noting that all of those are coming in through different pathways, and each one of them designates a different type of benefits associated with them, with some of them being able to access Medicaid and some not being able to access Medicaid. So I would say, you know, what I think that right now there isn't necessarily a sense of really envisioning what kind of mental health framework we can put in place for people that are here that takes into account all of the different pathways in which they come. And there's certainly not enough adequate and nuanced and multi-diverse, including prevention and community-led programming for folks. And the last thing I'll say before I stop is just noting that historically, including up to today, asylum seekers aren't eligible for any federal benefits, and in the vast majority of states, state benefits as well. So they are already excluded from any community mental health programs for the most part. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Do any of the other three panelists have anything to add?
Yes, I would love to. Thank you so very much for having me. And Beth, thank you very much for that introduction. I wanted to bring a bit of a different perspective to this. My name's Hawthorne Smith. I'm with the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture. And I wanted to talk more about folks who are sort of caught in the affirmative asylum backlog, who are a lot of the folks that we were treating here, and just the really horrific sort of ramifications this has for family systems and the ongoing mental health treatment for folks. We are dealing with something, some of our clients have been calling it the second torture. We've been looking at it more as sort of like the unseen family separation crisis, where we don't always have the vivid video or something that we see from the border, but we have many people who applied for asylum prior to January 2018, when the previous administration kind of flipped things on its head. And whereas it had been before that people arriving would sort of be treated in the order that they came, sort of a first in, first out, first come, first serve, whichever phrase you like to use, it was flipped on its head to become something more of last in, first out. And part of the at least the explanation to that was that there were so many people coming to the border. There's so many like current migrant crises that it made sense to really deal with the folks who were just arriving. But there was another sort of undercurrent where it seemed that decisions were being made where it's like, well, someone who's been here for a while might be plugged in with a program like ours at Bellevue, or maybe they already had an attorney, they had their work authorization, et cetera. Much harder to dislodge those people from the situation they're dealing with, as opposed to those who are just coming in. And so there was kind of the idea that maybe dealing with the most recent arrivals, they would be less difficult or easier to deport, as opposed to those people who already had some roots in the community. So we actually did some quantitative assessment of our folks back in February of 2020, not knowing that everything would grind to a huge halt the following month. But even at that point, we had 262 clients from our program who had applied for asylum prior to January 2018. So it could have been years before that. And of those 262, only about 14 had already been assigned for cases and they had already had their asylum interview. The rest were sort of put to the back of the line in this FIFO-LIFO. And unfortunately, some of those people are now further away from perhaps their first interview date than they were back in early 2020 with all the new arrivals. When we look at the arrivals from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, what's happening at the border. And I don't want to go too far now because there's a lot of folks, but I want just to say that the impact upon the primary clients that we're working with here who are far away from their families, who have extraordinary survivor guilt, and were they fleeing their responsibilities to come here just to leave their families in harm's way. The conversations with children where children have been accusing their parents of having a new family or new kids. That's the only reason they're not home for the birthday or what's going on over there. And so many of our clients in this position of having to explain what is inexplicable. And then on the good news, when we finally do have families reunited, and we can talk much more about this downstream, the difficulties in sort of bringing that family back together after such a long time of separation and resentment, fear, etc. It really does extend the length of the time we're working with folks in terms of intensive mental health services, and it also makes it a much deeper proposition. So let me just say that is an area of my approach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. It makes so much sense to think about the survivor's guilt that people must face, and they're in such different situations than friends and family may be back home. Along that line of just thinking about belonging and identity and perhaps surviving and being in a different place in their families and friends, I have a question to pose to Hannah at first. So Hannah, what are any ways that your agency approaches issues that are particular with youth and their sense of belonging? And what are ways that your agency has supported sociocultural identity development for refugee and immigrant youth in the area?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And that's a great question. So starting at intake, and just to mention, I'm one of the clinicians with the trauma system that's implementing or helping implement the trauma systems therapy for refugees at the University of Vermont. And so part of our work during intake, we use a measure to assess school belonging and bicultural identity. We also ask youth about their cultural identity, and if the youth is interested in spending time discussing identity formation and aspects of their culture that resonates with them, we spend time on that. We also discuss acculturation and navigating differences between values that children are learning in school and in their communities, and values that are important to their caregivers and larger family. For instance, one of my clients was navigating dating when not dating was an important value to the client's family and their religion. So we also support the child's caregiver in navigating the acculturation gap and raising a child who is bicultural, while also supporting the youth. Another way that TSTR specifically supports bicultural identity and navigating acculturation stress is through school and community-based groups. And the groups are comprised of children from the same cultural background or who have the shared experience of coming from refugee families. And similarly, one of the agencies that we partner with, AALV, the Association for Africans Living in Vermont, has a youth group and mentoring program for refugee teens. And as a clinician, I always make sure youth and families know about AALV and all it has to offer. And we generally suggest that youth become involved in the youth center to have that sense of community and belonging.
Thank you so much. And there's a follow-up question that is in the chat asking about, do people use pre and post assessments? And if so, what tools are these?
I can say for the Bellevue program for survivors of torture, when we are first meeting with clients, we do a pre-screening before the formal intake. And within the formal intake, beyond history taking and the sort of mental status exam that we do, we will also put forth the Harvard Trauma Questionnaire, as well as the PHQ-9, which focuses more on depressive symptoms. And by and large, for all of our clients who are then accepted into the program, we do have a follow-up 6 months downstream, where we're able to revisit both of those questionnaires, as well as more of a semi-structured interview to see where folks are. With our medical clinics and all that, the PHQ will be given over time, but definitely we get the snapshot for at least intake and 6 months later with other sort of benchmarks in between.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pose a question to Karubo. So what are services that you would like to see more of in community-based programming? And how can we think of extending the reach of such services and making them more sustainable?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a very important question. So today I just want to talk about a few things. The ones that come to mind really quickly are training and funding cultural broker positions to help with triage and referral to cultural trained mental health counselors. The other is mental health first aid training to all cultural brokers to better assess community need and help with referral, and utilize community members who have past medical training experience with non-traditional pathways to collaborate with clinicians and incorporate their experience into the medical field. From my experience as a case manager and community cultural advocate, I've often seen intercultural issues and dilemmas that arise when clinicians and social workers attempt to work with African refugee families. And I say this with all the love in my heart and in a non-blaming point of view, as I too have had many mishaps that have happened a long way. Now, this will include cultural and emotional issues, and maybe discrepancy from refugee families between their expectations and their lived reality. And it could be from stress and the migration process. It could be adaptation to the cultural norms of the new environment. And it could be health, no point of reference when they come in. Sometimes it's hard to tell what mental issues they have. It could be language barriers, it could be education. It's a myriad of issues. And I must say that I'm so fortunate to be one of the culture brokers that help bridge clinicians in their work through the TSTR model and connecting cultures. And it is really a wonderful program. However, I feel that there's a lot to learn for us, the culture brokers, the clinicians, and the social workers, in understanding the massive journeys that people are making and the situation they have come from, the fighting they've seen, the persecution, and the discrimination they continue to deal with when they're in their new environment. And this is why I strongly feel that we need to mine the wealth and knowledge resource that this community come with. And we need to consider what our lives would look like if we had bilingual licensed clinicians, bilingual social workers, and that they are well-versed and trauma-centered. And if we could expand a program that empowers and supports children as they begin their new lives in the United States, and how much easier it would be for all of us if that lens would include the refugee and immigrant families. I'm trying to say, let them lead. So how can we think of extending the reach of such services and making them sustainable? Well, as I said, we are sitting on a gold mine whilst trying to count our pennies. The community itself has the gold. We need to find the gaps. The cultural brokers are the vehicles, and they are the connectors. But their connection capacity could be improved. And I think it's safe to say that we're aware of the amount of time it takes for these families to build relationships to the point of trusting caregivers so that the true healing can begin. So what we need to do is just get rid of the things that hinder the trauma healing process, or waiting for it until it becomes unmanageable. We need to deepen cultural brokers' education so that collaboration with service providers is efficient. And so I think this can be done through various health and community education programs, and maybe finding a non-traditional way to facilitate for them to become clinicians and social workers, because obviously we don't have enough. Every state I hear about is struggling to find social workers and clinicians, especially the ones that are from the communities that they're trying to serve. So while I appreciate the TSTR program model, I have learned a lot from it, but it's it's um, it's not sufficient. I mean, it's all very well for cultural brokers to continue to attend clinical meetings as a learning process and to learn the perspective lens, but I think we need to bolster the cultural brokering lived experience and to move from unlicensed behavioral health professionals to certified ones. And how can we help them get to that standard quicker with a focus of the quality clinical care? How can we encourage clients to express their feelings and discuss what is happening in their lives? How can we teach them to remain safe when they're dealing with crisis intervention with clients? So just think, if this was to be done, it would benefit the healthcare professional givers and the communities. I often think about the schools. Imagine if we had professional teachers who are from the refugee communities themselves. I'm sure the added values as childhood educators would add a supportive learning environment for children who are bilingual. And if we were to help them integrate their heritage, their culture into the tools of the program, it would really enrich the children that are from refugee or migrant communities to share their heritage with the other children around them, and it would help the diversity of we as the Americans. And there's one more thing that I dream about that I wish, I don't know if we have the time. Do I have 2 minutes?
Yeah, maybe just one more minute and then
1 more minute.
we'll wrap up and then transition to Q&A.
Thank you. So the last one that I've been dreaming about is a retreat for refugees who are in crisis and who are suffering from trauma. I imagine that it would be in a cultural country setting, close to nature with vegetable gardens, and it would be run by our very own clinicians that would have healing and ethnic-centered activities where there can be, there's no distraction, because the models that are already in place don't cater to refugees and immigrant families. And so it doesn't take very long before they are seen in a way to distress before they are sent back to the very environments that are the core stress environments that sometimes lead them to need such an environment. So I think that's all the time I have for
Thank you so much. I think what you're saying about there being a lot of resources in these communities that we're perhaps not really harnessing to their full potential yet, as we think about all the gaps that exist in serving these communities. So I have one more question, and anyone on the panel can feel free to answer this. I'm curious what the rest of your thoughts are on confronting some of the barriers to getting folks from refugee and asylum seeking communities licensed as teachers, as social workers, as pediatricians. I think we're all probably in agreement here that we would really love to see leadership and solutions from the communities themselves. And we agree that there's sometimes these barriers where an American social worker or a teacher isn't able to kind of meet the needs of these communities in the way that somebody from their own community could. So what are some of the barriers that exist in transitioning this leadership and shifting that over? And then how can we think about confronting these barriers? And we just have a couple minutes. So if you could keep your responses brief, then we'll transition to the Q&A and open it up to everyone else.
I can only speak to the social work profession, but also to the structure if we're talking in particular about refugees who are coming with refugee status. Is when people come, the primary goal is self-sufficiency, which isn't a bad goal, but it also means that they really are starting in poverty and digging their way out of poverty. Getting an education and an advanced degree is pretty difficult when you're trying to dig yourself out of poverty. And at least in the social work profession, to get an MSW, you have to do a huge amount of unpaid practicum, which is just not sustainable for people who don't have extra, resource margins. And so I do think right now, at least for getting an MSW, it's very much structured to keep people who are privileged in they're just much more likely to complete. I'll also say that I do think we need to diversify from very highly specialized treatment versus no treatment. We need things across the entire spectrum that don't necessarily require licensed people as well, and that are seen as just as valuable and funded. And there also needs to be research around those types of community-driven efforts. Now, certainly if somebody has a significant issue, you're not going to want, a prevention program is not necessarily what you need, but there is a place for lots and lots of different types of modalities out there. But right now we really operate under a binary of extremely expensive treatment or no treatment at all, in my opinion.
Oftentimes when we conceptualize what survivors are going through, we talk about the bad news of the sense that they are faced with so many challenges at once. But the good news in terms of being service providers is that there are so many different ways to intervene and to engage that can have some tangible benefit. I think that it's a similar sort of process when we look around issues of culture and accessibility and all that, that the challenges are widespread. And because of that, I think there are definitely different ways that we need to engage. So one of them in terms of training and the professional, credentialing of folks, and that is a very slow process. That's one of those moving the battleship or what have you. So we're seeing more externs and interns and social work interns and whatever from various communities that are impacted, and reaching out as much as we can to help train folks. And when people come here, that's one aspect. But while that's happening, to also reach out to the clinicians who are doing this work, and really some of that training and exposure, again, to allow that to come from the voices and the insights of the survivors, to make sure that this is not a top down, we're the experts, this is what y'all need to do, but to always be refreshing our knowledge and challenging ourselves with, here's what I was taught in grad school, but here's what I'm hearing from the folks I'm working with. How can we incorporate this? And then beyond, just so we don't get into that sort of notion like, oh, well, I'm dealing with a woman from a Latin American country who's in her 20s. She's going to comport herself like this, or a 35-year-old male from Iraq or what have you. rather than just looking at the reference group identities, how are people making sense of that? How do we relate with them as human beings? And not only just looking at potential cultural differences, but also assumptions of cultural similarity that can also get in the way of our work just as much as anything else.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm now going to start taking some of the questions from the chat that are coming up. And as I ask these questions, anyone who feels like they would like to answer on the panel, please feel free. We can go around. Anyone who would like to add anything. First question is, what practices are useful for reducing burnout and secondary trauma for both yourselves and for members of your teams and your staff?
Well, that's, of course, a crucial question, and I think bodes for a longer conversation perhaps than we have time for, but just a few things that bounce around in my head are, one, that we are again dealing with folks who are so multiply challenged and all of that, and that understanding that we have to sort of set limits in terms of our own expectations, that we're not going to go out and be able to solve everything for everybody. We're not going to be able to save everybody. And my very first day as a counselor, someone actually pulled my coat to it and said, you know, you're not actually going to be able to save anybody. All you can do is help to put someone in the context where they can work to save themselves. We're guides, and this sort of keeping that within sense. And then also realizing that we are hearing some of the worst things that human beings do to one another. We're bearing witness to that, and we're oftentimes that first line of reception when people are finally being able to talk about this. And it takes a toll, but at the same time that we're hearing about the worst things human beings do to one another, we are coming face to face every day with these incredible manifestations of human resilience. And these clients that we work with who are refusing to relinquish their humanity, you know, despite the purposeful and violent ways that their humanity is being attacked. And I think that sometimes trying to hold on to those two things at the same time is really beneficial. Let me stop there.
Do any of the other panelists have anything to add for that question about burnout and secondary trauma?
We struggle with it. I mean, we have a big duty of care department. That's all they do is try to work on this. I will often say that the people's past trauma is one thing that I think for the most part is easier to process than the ongoing trauma, discrimination, marginalization, and just the abject ongoing kind of violence of poverty, systems that are broken. Those things are really difficult because they're not in the past, they're ongoing, and they're happening in our communities, and we often feel uncertain how to solve them. But I would say, to be honest, we really struggle with this, and we do have a whole department at International Rescue Committee called Duty of Care just devoted to this.
A book that the clinicians at Connecting Cultures read together is called Trauma Stewardship, and that's I found that to be a really helpful resource as well.
If I may just add one or two more things, and I swear I'll stop talking. You know, one of the things I think we've learned, and I see Tim Kelly's on the call from ORR and all that, and things we talked about in terms of, especially with the asylum backlog I was referencing earlier, and then COVID and everything, you know, we can have a 6 to 8 week trauma focused CBT thing, but for someone who's sitting and waiting for their asylum for 8 years, you know, what does that mean? So that sometimes I think we have to get to that realization that nothing we do is going to feel sufficient. We cannot solve these problems, but not losing the fact that everything we are doing and everything we are attempting to do and contributing is important and is necessary. And I think that sometimes trying to find that equilibrium is a very important way of keeping ourselves engaged. And the very last thing I'll say, some of my clients taught me in terms of their own healing processes, that they almost see their healing as subversive, that is actually part of the, sort of pushing back against human rights abuses and all that, that this is part and parcel of who they are. Healing is part of this struggle. And I almost like just sort of crib that. So getting away from subversive healing to subversive wellness, and the fact that us taking care of ourselves and really hanging in is something that fuels our ability and our efforts to stay in this work and to be effective with it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that sounds so important to keep in mind. And now we're running, we have about 5 minutes left. So I want to ask one more question, and I'm sorry I can't get to everyone's questions. There's so many great questions in the chat. But I want to ask the panelists about collaboration. So there's a question about how can we better collaborate and share knowledge and resources between programs and across agencies. For example, there are so many agencies in Boston supporting refugees and immigrants in the area. So what are some examples that you all have seen about working across agencies and teams and maybe sharing resources and knowledge with each other?
I swore I would stop talking.
Now we want you to talk again.
Yeah, there we go, right? So beyond working here at Bellevue, I serve currently as the president of the National Consortium of Torture Treatment Programs, which is just one example of sort of a national, even international program where people are able to join. We just recently had a big symposium in Washington, D.C. and all that. But, through the National Capacity Building Program, where a lot of trauma-related resources are available and things like that. It's really just about connecting these dots, because I think that so many of us are out there sort of inventing the wheel on our own, that any sort of processes, and again, I know that for the next panel you have, I know that Tim Kelly will be looking at that, and as someone with Office of Refugee Resettlement who has contact with so many folks, I think conversations like this are a very important first step so that we know that there are other folks out there doing this wonderful work and we can be proactive about connecting.
I'll just add to that I think Switchboard is a great place to go to ask what's being done. But I would also really encourage people to go to their state refugee health coordinator and see about, if you're looking for what are the solutions in your particular state or geographic locale, and think about maybe a working group related to just that. Usually the state refugee coordinator will have a good idea of who's working in the health and mental health space, and they can pull people together. And I think that those kind of new arrival working groups can be really powerful ways to create solutions and share resources and ideas.
In my job as a caseworker and leading a group of women that survived war and torture, I have been collaborating with a lot of caregivers. I'll give you an example. Recently, in the past week, I worked with the birthing center from the UVM Medical Center, where the birthing center was keen on understanding the culturally and trauma that women suffer. And in that period, we had women from Congo were talking about their concerns and their, the cultural practices that they are accustomed to. And this was like a session of collecting information and looking for ways to improve the way they deal with in prenatal and in labor and in delivery and also in postmortem for these women. And this was really eye-opening when they found that there were so many mishaps that were taking place at their department, and from that they thought of building capacity from the community where they can collaborate with midwives who are already in the community that would work as doulas and help in interpretation, because sometimes, they are not able to find an interpreter right at the time, and it has not been a very good experience for the mother who's trying to give birth. So when you collaborate with caregivers around your community, it helps connect the community to other resources. They get to learn what's around them and what kind of help that they can get right away. And we are, as an association of Africans, that name is actually misleading because we don't just deal with Africans, we deal with all the immigrants and all asylum seekers. When we started as an African association, but we've had so many refugees that followed after, including people from Afghanistan and Syria and even in Europe. So when you partner and with your goal or a lens of just helping the people around you, it's a very rich and thriving community when that is happening.
Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists for your time and being so generous answering all of our questions today. I felt like this panel was extremely helpful for just considering how to do high quality work in a context where our systems have been very decimated, where our resources are very stretched in the political context, and we're dealing with policies such as the Remain in Mexico program that do affect the mental health of refugees and immigrants and everyone that we're serving. So it was really helpful to hear all of your thoughts about how we want to start shifting power and shifting the dynamics to build up local leadership in these communities to solve some of the problems that we're all working on, to hear about resources such as Switchboard that can build collaboration and communication across all of these agencies that are working in really similar spaces, and leveraging a lot of the resources that we already have, so we are not recreating the wheel. We also know that we have a lot to learn still, and we're learning a little bit about the benefits and still the challenges associated with modalities like TSTR, and the challenges of working in spaces where we are bearing witness to a lot of really challenging stories that we're hearing from refugees and immigrants firsthand, wanting to do our best serving these populations, but of course, operating with limited resources nationally and individually. So it's really wonderful to hear from all of you and from all of your experiences from your years working in this field in different positions. So I just wanted to thank you again for your time, and everyone feel free to follow up with a panelist one-on-one. We're sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions, but hopefully answered a good bit of them. So thank you again. And now I want to transition and introduce Tim Kelly, who will be moderating the second panel about policy and systems. So Tim is currently the program manager of the Survivors of Torture program in the Division of Refugee Health at the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So prior to this position, Tim has worked with refugees and immigrants through his work as the manager of the Immigration and Refugee Services program at New Hampshire Catholic Charities and the director of social work at Advocates for Survivors of Torture and Trauma. So Tim, I will turn it over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'll be facilitating this second session on policy and systems panel. My name is Tim Kelly, as Laura mentioned, and we'll be hearing from 4 speakers on this panel. I'm excited to introduce Mary Miller Flowers, Helen McGurk, Dr. Ngozi Enalama, and Tara Wright. I'll give a brief bio before we get into the questions and discussion. Mary Miller Flowers is currently a senior policy analyst for child protection at the Youth Center for Immigrant Children's Rights. Since earning a master's in international affairs from Columbia and a master's in divinity from the Candler School of Theology at Emory, Mary has worked both domestically and in West Africa to improve access to justice among vulnerable criminal defendants. And prior to her work with the Young Center, Mary held the position of Associate Director for Justice at the Open Society Foundation, human rights initiative, where she managed global grants related to criminal justice and the support of civil society activists. Our second speaker is Helen McGuirk. Helen volunteered as a public health volunteer in Kenya through the Peace Corps early in her career, which inspired her to work towards a master's in public health. She now works as a refugee health coordinator at Michigan's Refugee Services. And this program provides refugees with the resources they need to rebuild their lives in order to survive, thrive, and contribute to their community. Helen's team also recently began collaboration with the RPCA to support the implementation of the family strengthening intervention for refugees. And our third speaker is Dr. Ngozi Enalama. Ngozi earned both an MBA and a master's in education before coming to Boston College, where she earned both her MSW and PhD. She now works as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at the University of New Hampshire. Her focus is primarily on raising awareness and promoting evidence regarding health disparities among women and children in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Black immigrant and refugee families in the US. And our fourth speaker is Tara Wright. Tara serves as Senior Manager of Content Design for Sesame Workshop. She's responsible for creating child and parent-facing multimedia content to support their overall well-being, and especially to promote positive, nurturing relationships. She has also been responsible for creating courses, trainings, and implementation experiences for providers to equip them with the tools, strategies to support their important work with children and families. So welcome to our distinguished panel. And to start, I will ask the panel to respond to 4 questions. And after that, we'll open it up for question and answer with the audience. So the first question I'll direct to Mary to start. What are some programmatic or policy recommendations for strengthening the mental health response for refugee children and families in the United States?
Thanks very much, Tim, for that question and for the introductions that you just gave. Maybe just quickly before answering the question, a little bit about the Young Center, because we serve a particular population of immigrant children, which are called unaccompanied immigrant children. And these kids are asylum seeking, or they're seeking other forms of protection like a trafficking visa or a special immigrant juvenile visa. They arrive at our borders, generally the southern border, and they are determined to be unaccompanied if they arrive without a parent or legal guardian. So this is a particular subsection of kids. And I think that's why that is important, is because they don't have refugee protections. They don't have refugee status. They are in a very much a legal limbo, and permanency is what they are seeking, but it is quite a process before many of these children achieve any form of permanency. And so the Young Center's role, we have a policy team of which I am a part, but most of our staff is working with these children while they are detained in federal custody. And so our program has a multidisciplinary team of staff, social workers and lawyers and volunteers who all work to get to know a child, to know their story. And then rather than representing them in court as their lawyer as their primary lawyer, we serve in a guardian ad litem role. That is, we are arguing for what is in the best interest of the child, because as many of you probably know, there is no federal best interest standard. There's no mandate that under immigration law that children be treated in their capacity as children first. And so the Office of Refugee Resettlement has the ability to refer children to the Young Center for appointment of a child advocate. And we only serve a very small percentage of this group of kids because there are just too many and the resources are not there. But the Young Center serves the kiddos who we would deem most vulnerable. That is children who have disabilities, and that includes mental health struggles, children who are pregnant or parenting, children who speak languages other than Spanish or English, particularly Indigenous speaking children, children who are likely to have complicated cases leading to prolonged detention, which could often be a trafficking case or something more complicated, and children who are 17 and a half. We tend to get all of the older children because we want to help them get a plan in place before they age out of ORR's custody system. And of course, all of the babies and toddlers get referred for child advocates because it is difficult when children are pre-verbal or very young to understand what it is that might be in their best interest without a lot of support. So that's the population of children that the Young Center serves. And I think it's important to know that because they don't often have access to the same kinds of mental health programming and physical health programming that refugee children do, because while they are legally present in terms of being allowed to apply for asylum or other form of protection, and while their immigration case is proceeding, they are not eligible for public benefits in the majority of states. I think it's 11 states that have now extended some form of Medicaid or CHIP coverage to these children without a waiting period. Other states have, waiting period, other states have partial coverage, and some states have no coverage. And it really just depends where the child lands as to what access to services they can obtain. And then of course, they're in a constant state of legal limbo, which means there's no clarity on when permanency for these kids will be achieved. You can have a child who spends a year in immigration proceedings, or you can have a child who spends 7 years in immigration proceedings. And they're often released from federal custody to sponsors who are also in a state of legal limbo, meaning they don't have permanency themselves. So as you probably know from your own experience, when parents and family members have trouble accessing services, it can be quite difficult for children to access those services as well. Now, to answer your question a little bit, Tim, I apologize, and I don't know how much time I have, but there have been some good innovations. Of course, ORR provides some post-release services for a small percentage of kids, and when those are done well, they can include case management, they can include networking up of children to school enrollment and to federally qualified health centers, other places where they can access care. We found that getting kids enrolled in public school can be one of the best ways for them to get access to medical and mental health treatment. And when schools have a more wraparound service model, when they bring in community health organizations, when they include not only health organizations, but also those who can provide referrals for other types of services, legal service providers, food support, all the different financial counselors, other kinds of service providers, when those can be included in the set of services children can access at school or in some other community location, it's much easier for these families to be able to get access to the care they need. Many of these families are living very much on the margins. So logistics, transportation, figuring out how to fill out forms when English is not your first language, and the above, all those concerns really multiply. So having one-stop shop opportunities can really help. And we've also seen that sometimes direct access to health guidance through telephone or hotlines can also be a way for children's families to access care and children themselves when there's a time of urgent need. I think I'll stop there, Tim. I'm just not sure what our timing is, but I've said too much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that introduction to the center and your response to question 1. I'll open it up to the other panelists. Feel free to give a brief intro to your program or position as well. And then I can repeat the question also. So the question is, what are some programmatic or policy recommendations for strengthening the mental health response for refugee children and families in the U.S.?
Hi, Tim. I can go ahead and respond for what we're doing in Michigan. So I'm Helen McGurk. I'm the State Refugee Health Coordinator here in Michigan. It was mentioned earlier in the previous panel that a lot of arrivals, asylum seekers specifically, don't have access to health benefits like a refugee arrival would. And so that's a pretty big issue here in Michigan, and I think a lot of other states too that didn't enact any CHIPRA expansion or any other Medicare expansion. Thankfully, we do have a refugee advisory committee here in Michigan, and our office has been working to help them advocate for Medicaid and other benefits that they should be eligible for. So Michigan is one of only 16 states that still doesn't allow eligible lawfully residing children to obtain Medicaid and CHIP coverage without a 5-year wait. So in Michigan, we're advocating and urging our legislature to pass legislation and funding necessary to enact the CHIPRA expansion. So that's the 2009 Children's Health Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. And that gives states the option to waive the 5-year waiting period for Medicaid and CHIP for lawfully residing children up to 21 years old and pregnant people. Through this option, if we were able to do this, Michigan could enroll thousands of eligible lawfully residing children in healthcare programs, and they could receive substantial federal matching funds to do that. We are, in summary, really working with our refugee advisory committee. So these are people who came as refugees and other humanitarian arrivals to work with our legislature and make them aware of the issue and how many people here in Michigan actually could be eligible for Medicaid and other benefits if the CHIPRA was enacted here in Michigan.
Thank you very much, Helen. It's a very direct policy concern, and glad to hear there's advocacy around that, and more states need to be doing what you're doing. So thank you. Open it up to Tara or Ngozi.
Sure, I'll chime in. I'm Tara Wright. I'm from Sesame Workshop, and I work to create content for children and families. And recently we've expanded our work and kind of built on some of our international colleagues' work to develop resources for displaced and resettling populations, especially those very youngest children. And I guess the only thing that I would really emphasize here is, again, just that need for awareness and recognizing that very young children are experiencing these things and they're going through tremendous challenges, sometimes unaccompanied, unfortunately. And so I think that we just need to, a big recommendation would just be acknowledging this population and that they need specific care and supports because of where they are developmentally and, approaching their developmental milestones and how to support them through that trauma-informed lens and just having those supports. So I know that Mary mentioned, connecting them early to school systems. I think whatever we can do to connect them to Head Start or other early childhood resources, even community groups, mother and child groups, whatever we can do to connect those families with very young children to the supports they need would be a great place to start. And it's a gap, I think, in this area, a place to grow.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. Just to add to what they've been saying, if you look at the issues of having insurance and actually having access, one of the challenges that we've experienced here are most families that are immigrant and refugee who are even afraid of going to even apply, even when you have the child's health insurance that's available to you, or there's services, maybe a member of the family is not legal. And so the fear that other members of the family, because of one person, they might get disqualified. So what we're doing mostly with the nonprofits and the agencies, community organizations, is to help them create awareness and reduce that fear, that barrier, that you can go and assess this. And this is how to complete the application forms, reduce all the confusion about the eligibility. Of course, as we've seen all through the different panelists, the problem of language and literacy challenges, even having to go back to renew when the year is over, the year of coverage is over. So these are some of the barriers, and what we're doing is working with the CBOs, the agencies serving them, the community base, to help them bridge that gap, give them an information that makes it easy for them to actually assess the system, at least the provisions that are already available, to get access to service and actually use those services while overcoming the barriers that are existing at the moment in terms of language and culture.
Thank you all very much for those responses. And a few of you, all of you, talked about the need for awareness, which we're going to address a little bit more in depth during our question number 2, which is, how can we promote greater awareness and understanding of the mental health needs of refugee children? And what are some of the key strategies for addressing stigma around mental health among newcomers? And for this question, let's start with Helen.
Absolutely. That's a great question, and I think a great theme for this panel also. So as the state refugee health coordinator, I think one of my roles is to ensure that mental health is discussed equally with all other health conditions that are commonly seen in newcomers. I really try to normalize mental health in conversations. It makes it easier to advocate for funding, and I feel like it also makes it easier for our service providers to educate clients about mental health services that are available to them. The same strategy, I feel like, goes for addressing stigma around newcomer mental health. Even before our refugees arrive, our resettlement agencies are checking their bio data to prepare for any and all health conditions, and that includes any mental health conditions that are flagged by our panel physicians overseas. We make sure to provide education and opportunities to discuss the mental health as soon as the client arrives here in the US. We definitely try to take a more holistic approach to mental health and try to make sure that it's available and discussed at all health events that are being held. For example, about a year ago, we held a dental clinic in one of our temporary housing hotels that we were housing Afghans in during Operation Allies Welcome. They were housed in temporary housing because we were waiting for more permanent housing options to become available. While they were at the hotel, we were trying to offer as many health services as possible so that they could at least have access to it while they were staying there and waiting for their permanent housing. One of the things we did was a dental clinic because there were high dental needs. And I think it's important, you know, when you're addressing a medical issue, to try and holistically approach all issues at the same time. A lot of people did not have access to dental care when they were in Afghanistan. So we tried to make sure, especially for the children, that there was a mental health care provider there to kind of be there to support the children as they were getting their dental checkups. It was really terrifying for some of the children and even adults because they hadn't been in that situation before. And there's often pain and trauma that could be associated with dental care. So we wanted to make sure that we had that mental health individual there for them. And also making sure that we're not concentrating or focusing on just one single westernized approach like therapy, that we're also looking at other ways that we could serve mental health needs. So, I mean, we had a small like art table set up at the dental clinic. And it's, you know, it's something fun that's for the kids, but also it can be a tool for therapy. So we had an art therapist there who was actually able to like have discussions with the children about what they were going through. And often when you approach therapy in that way, the children don't know that they are kind of being assisted in that way, but it's actually a really great tool to make sure everyone's in an okay mindset, you know, during the dental clinic and everything like that. I mean, we've done a lot of other programs. I think the other thing that's really important about awareness, in addition to speaking, is just partnering with a lot of these professional and other agencies like RPCA. And we have a lot of universities here in Michigan that we also partner with to provide some of these therapeutic services. And so just the more we talk about mental health and the major need it is for refugees, we've kind of find there's a lot more interest in people wanting to help.
Wonderful. Thank you, Helen. Some great practical information for others to, you know, that are interested in raising awareness. Open it up to the other panelists. So the question is about raising awareness and understanding of mental health needs, as well as addressing issues related to stigma.
Well, if I may come in here, one of the things that we do, like in our school, we have a lot of our social work students who are in agencies, and then through them we reach out to ask, you know, to have trainings for the supervisors, and we go on these visits to look at the sites. And one of the things you observe is the publicity materials, right? You know, mental health facilities. Well, who is advertised there? What kind of pictures do clients see? Are there pictures that the refugee or immigrant family can see themselves there and know that they're welcome here, right? So starting from the publicity, how do you know that, you know, give them that opportunity to see that, look, this place can serve me. I can walk in here. It's not just for people of a particular ethnicity or people who look a certain way can come in here. And of course, we continue to emphasize training on cultural awareness and sensitivity, trying to see things, try to see where your client is coming from by the time they come in. So basically, the general awareness that is going to the whole US population, you know, as much as we can to adapt this and include these populations, to let them know that they are part of the people here. And of course, in terms of the stigma, that stigma also cuts across. One of the things that we thought about was, how do you get from the first point, you're going to the legal service, the legal team. They have a protocol of questions you have to answer. They have a protocol of how to help you get into the system. How do we begin to incorporate even mental health issues so they know that it's understandable? Because of what we've come through, because of our journey, because of our process, we are bound to have these challenges. And so we can begin to normalize them, know that they can expect, more challenges, whatever language, all that we've developed in our evidence, in our research that shows the language that our communities understand in terms of mental health. How do we even begin from the legal services to help them know that this is normal? It's normal to be stressed. You know, what are the signs? Are you worried? Are you often thinking this is okay because of where you are now? And so we use that as a process to normalize the information about mental health, to know it's expected, and to know that they can actually go and find services. Of course, again, awareness, look at what are the other catchment areas. Definitely our schools. My focus is on high schools with immigrant youth. With my prior work with adolescents, you know that this is the stage where there's peer-to-peer. They look more at what are the young people around me doing? How are they seeing things beyond what the parent or an adult has to say to them? And so how do we use the fellow peers to raise awareness? We have the training that we're designing for peer educators who communicate in the language of teens and make this, make it commonplace, just the way the slangs catch on among them. How do discussions around how you're feeling, how you're stressed, catch on? The other thing also is when we have English language learning programs, our translatory programs, how do we incorporate stories? For instance, stories always stick. Stories about trauma, about stigma in our training programs, like you're teaching an English course, like you went to school and you did comprehension and you answered the questions. You learned a good story, and those stories always stick. So these stories about what other migrant or refugee families have gone through in a story form, in a mental health form, how they went to this facility and they got service. So it's normal to get service. It's normal to get this help so you can move on. Just like you're getting help with your driver's license, to getting a home, it's normal to get this. Is part of that whole picture. So it becomes like our story. And I know that that's so impactful when it becomes a story that you can tell and you are aware of it. And that way it doesn't look like a stigma. Oh my God, because our interpretation in Africa is that when you begin to talk about mental health, you're talking about madness. This person is crazy, has gone, crazy. And that's something that it's ingrained. Nobody wants to have that attached to them because it has implications for how far other families see you, who you get married to, and all of that. So when we can use the language that they understand and appreciate, that would be so helpful in
Thank you,
making this
Ngozi.
happen.
I
Yes.
appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay.
Culturally appropriate response, so people can see themselves in the agency that is providing services and the agency using language they can understand. So does anybody else have a quick comment on question 2? Otherwise, for the sake of time, I might move to question 3.
I just want to say one quick thing. So we have a special gift in the Muppets, at Sesame. We kind of get to cheat a little bit because we have these friendly Muppets who can kind of, any child can see themselves in these characters. But I just want to echo the sentiments that you just said, Ngozi, because, awareness is two sides. It's both the others looking in, and it's the refugees themselves, so you have to create as best you can these scenes, these stories to help people from the outside see these newcomers as valuable, as wonderful, as someone to learn from and befriend. And then you have to help the refugees themselves and these children really see themselves as part of their new community. So I think it's a challenge, but as much as we can, and this is what we're trying to do at Sesame, is to really represent and model, our friendly Muppets and some new characters going through similar challenges or related challenges, big feelings, grief, feelings of grief or changes. We're trying to embody some of those big challenges. But I think the flip side of that is that we also have to model these newcomers in really positive situations as well, to allow themselves to see what's possible for them in the future. So, really turning it to joy. We talk a lot about the struggles. They have particular struggles. These families come with, so much trauma, so much hardship, but they also have so much strength and so much that we can learn from. So I think an important part of awareness is representing both the challenges and the joys and the strengths of these people who are coming to our community.
Thank you very much, Tara. I appreciate that. So the other two questions, you folks already touched upon it, both of them. One was, what can the current administration, states and federal governments do to ensure more resilient and sustainable systems of care for refugees? The fourth question was looking beyond just the case management and mental health services. How do we integrate care into other systems for refugees. So, we saw that, integrating mental health into a dental clinic, for example. And so I'm going to leave those questions open, and unless there's a quick comment that any of you would like to make on those two questions, because I want to make sure we have time to go to the Q&A with the audience. So any last comments on those questions 3 and 4? Okay, so we're at 2:30, and we've got, it was a great discussion to get started, and I think the audience is quite engaged and interested in asking questions. So let me just pull up the list of questions, and if we have time, we can go back to those questions 3 and 4 for a bit more discussion. But this first question from the audience is from somebody who would like to know what mental health supports are available for asylum seekers and refugees that have other disabilities as well. Are we ensuring that the supports are available are culturally competent? So that's a good question. I think, Mary, you mentioned serving clients with complex needs. Maybe you could start off with this question.
Yeah, Tim, thanks. I'm happy to start off, although I don't have a lot of great examples, so maybe other panelists can fill in. I mean, we see a great gap in the availability of mental health services for that are culturally competent, trauma informed, right? So many of the kids who are released from OR custody with post-release services end up sitting on a wait list for 6 to 9 months for those services. And then access to Spanish language mental health providers is quite slim. And other language providers can also be quite difficult to come by. And then when you're looking at children with disabilities, you have lots of layers to be managed. And when children with disabilities are in custody, they often don't have access to some of the services they would, such as special education, 504 plans. They may have access to more therapeutic interventions than released to a family that can't access Medicaid. But there's a lot of challenges around even diagnosing disability, and then children in congregate care really don't have individualized treatment plans. So it's quite difficult to ensure that children with disabilities have access to the therapeutic support that they need, particularly that is culturally competent and language accessible. And I would say that gets even harder when released into the community if you cannot access those wraparound services or benefits, particularly if your family is also struggling to meet the sort of daily needs. So I don't have great examples. I can talk about the problems, though. Maybe someone else can share good examples.
Thank you, Mary, for framing that question, and just open it up to the other panelists for any comments that you'd like to make on that. So the question again was, what mental health supports are available for asylum seekers and refugees that have other disabilities as well? And how can we ensure that they're culturally competent? So Ngozi talked about the importance of cultural, adaptation, culturally appropriate care. Do you have any thoughts, Ngozi, about the people we're serving that have other disabilities, and how can we work with, say, a state agency that isn't used to serving this population?
Like she said, this is still at the infancy, being able to accommodate persons who have disabilities from in the already existing framework that we have. But I would say that there's some areas and some research services who are already doing this. And what we can do is to say, how do we adapt what's working, what interventions is working in other communities to our own community. And I keep, my mind kept going back to what Ms. Webster Campbell said about the informal systems, the community as gold. You know, I feel that that's one of the assets that we have not really dug into in terms of the power of advocacy from the community when they're able to help them to build their capacity to advocate for this. I don't think there's a voice that will be stronger than when families from the communities are also seen and can speak about this gap as well, lend their voice. And what I think that what we can do is to strengthen them, you know, like training in advocacy beyond the tax shifting, you know, trying to get them to do more. Families are already trying to meet their income, meet their needs, you know, in other areas. So what's presently available is primarily from the schools, what's the provisions in terms of what a child gets from either health insurance or from the school. But I think going forward, what we can do is empower our communities, look at the goal that we have in our community and be able to have a front that can advocate to get better services for our children that have these disabilities so that it can be in mainstream. I mean, they're already struggling enough because when you talk about the English language learning program, which everybody gets pushed into, the program is quite deficient in the sense that by the time you're through, you don't even have enough English to go to higher education. That's already a challenge, right? Based on that program. And that's where everybody gets pushed into. So these are some of the things that are challenging that we need to find ways to address.
Thank you, Ngozi. So Helen, you had previously highlighted the need for holistic systems of care where you have one location providing multiple services, and that does seem to be a way to approach this question. And wonder if you had any comments.
Absolutely. This is the question about support to refugee and migrant communities and how we can support their communities.
Yeah, particularly with refugees and asylum seekers with other disability or, with a disability that, in addition to the health and mental health services and some of the general health needs, how can we ensure that those services are culturally appropriate and integrated?
Yeah. We work really closely with the communities where our refugees are resettling into. And so that's why it's so important for us to know not only where our refugees are going, but our asylees and other, eligible populations like parolees. We want to make sure that the communities have these types of systems set up in place so that we can ensure that there's a sustainable approach to keeping the refugees and other arrivals there. It's difficult for me to speak to specific communities and if there are any support systems in place for other programs. It is something that we highly encourage. And so we really try to make sure that those connections are made between mental health providers and other support systems like any LGBTQ community agencies and any other providers that are able to offer that niche approach. We really try to make sure, at least at the state level, that each individual community, although they offer different services and may cater to different cultures in some way, that they have those supports available so that if a refugee does arrive and need those extra additional supports, there's an agency or a community sponsor that's available to help and assist in that way. So I think in answer to the question, it really does depend on the community that that the refugee is arriving into.
Very good. Thank you, Helen. So Tara, if you have any thoughts about that, feel free to let us know. Otherwise, the second question, let me just pose that right now as well. What opportunities are there policy-wise, I would say program-wise as well, to support undocumented refugees and their families? So, Tara, from your perspective, what kind of programming could we do that would support, undocumented refugees and their families? And, if you want to talk about disabilities and how do we support refugees with disabilities as well, that'd be great.
Sure. So I think, one of the biggest things and one of the main goals at Sesame Workshop is to nurture and really help facilitate positive interactions between children and grown-ups. So typically that's a parent or a caregiver. In this situation, it might be a variety of grown-ups. And, I think one thing that I've heard again and again in this conversation in the previous panel, unfortunately, is this shortage of mental health professionals, just the shortage and capacity level of not having enough people to serve in sort of that professional role. One thing I just wanted to mention kind of on the same vein is I think there's a real opportunity here to kind of expand the pool of who those nurturing and caring adults can be. So it's, it doesn't need to be only clinicians, but it's, every touch point that these children have, every staff person, every person in a hallway or an intake center, every person has an opportunity to have a positive interaction with a child. And I think that it's really important not to lose sight that those interactions really matter. So that smiling face or a kind word or a listening ear can really make a difference to a child's sense of comfort and security, which in these situations is really the first thing we need to focus on. So I hope I'm not getting away from the question too much, but I just want to emphasize that, when we think even at the programmatic level, it's, how can we level up all our staff members? How can we level up every provider, every touch point, every person that a child might interact with and that a family might interact with, to have them understand, again, that awareness piece, right? So how can we help them understand what children are going through and the important effect that that person can have on a child's trajectory or just how they're coping with this really hard day. I think that bringing it down to that human interaction level can be really meaningful, especially to young children, where comfort and safety, security, those things are really first and foremost when we're addressing that problem. So I think I got a little bit away from the question, but that's kind of, we're talking about all these big picture things, and sometimes it helps to bring it back down to that single interaction.
Thank you very much, Tara. The expansion was very helpful to look beyond the clinician and the formal service provider to all adults. And I think that question, how can we provide opportunities to expand understanding of what children are going through and to promote positive interactions, is a great strategy. So let me pose the last question and give you guys another opportunity to respond to this question or the last one as well. Well, another question's been added. We probably just have time for one, though. What are some ways to open up funding resources for mental health services to include financial support for community-based and informal systems of care? The general question about funding to include both financial support for community-based and informal systems of care. So let me open it up to anybody who would like to start with that question. Important funding question.
I can't say much about funding other than I know that currently their Office of Refugee Resettlement provides funding to these post-release service providers. And those service providers are often community-based organizations or liaise with community-based organizations to provide that care. There's work right now to expand the number of children who receive those post-release services and to triage those services so that children who need more support get more support, and other children who perhaps need less support can have different ways of engaging with community-based services. So I think there is some opportunity to think about funding mechanisms and strengthening those funding streams. Also, the unaccompanied refugee minor program runs a bit differently than the ORR-UC program, and the states get funding to run that program. And through that program, any child that is eligible for the unaccompanied refugee minor program gets Medicaid eligibility, regardless of what state they are living in, which is a huge benefit, especially for children with disabilities, to be able to access more services. So I think there are ways we could play with the funding streams. We in the policy world do a lot of work on appropriations to try to push Congress to make some of those changes, but also agency work as well.
Thank you, Mary. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we appreciate all of your insightful comments and the questions from the audience, and lots to ponder as we move forward. So thank you again to Mary, Helen, Ngozi, and Tara for joining us on this panel. And I'd now like to pass it on to Jeff, who'll be introducing the Padlet activity. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to our panelists and Tim and to our previous panelists as well. So much sort of amazing content was surfaced and shared, and I've been taking vigorous notes as well. As a forecast, folks, there'll be documentation that comes out down the road for folks around resources and sort of key highlights from this meeting. We're now going to do a Padlet activity, which is a sort of a digital board for folks to surface their ideas. So we're going to share our screen, and you'll see in the chat there will be a link coming in the chat, and there should be a slide coming up on the screen for the Padlet, which is it's an online bulletin board, and there'll be a link in the chat. So folks, what you can do is click on that link in the chat. Another window will open up in your browser, and there are 2 prompt questions that you can respond to. So the link just came in the chat, and you'll see it says like a blue scene with mountain vista, and it'll say, please respond to one or both of the questions below. 1, something I learned today and feel inspired about, and then 2, something I will carry forward into my work, for example, a concrete action step. And the goal here is just to continue to document what people's reactions are, since we don't have the opportunity to be in person. At the corner of your screen, you'll see there's a little blue circle with a white plus mark. Click that, and then a little window will come up, and you can type in your content. And then at the bottom of that, you should be able to publish it with another click. And so what we're going to do is just take a couple of minutes. I'll quiet my voice so folks can just type some stuff in there, and then we'll be able to save this document as well, and we'll synthesize these so folks will be able to see the content there. If you have questions about using the Padlet, again, put them in the chat. Key thing, open up the link, then click that blue button, type, and submit. And we'll share the screen so folks can see what we're seeing. And so as these start to come in, again, folks can just see where other folks are at. I'll try to highlight a couple of them, and then I'll pass it over to Dr. Heidi Ellis, the director of our program, who will have some closing comments. When Heidi is talking, Morgan is also going to put a link to the chat to a feedback survey. We'd love to hear folks' comments. We invite you to try to do that before we head out at 3. So that's just, if you like this meeting, you found it helpful, great, let us know. If there are things you'd love to see for the future when we run this meeting, we'd love to hear it as well. And we really appreciate your voice when we do read the comments. So a lot of stuff coming in here. I'll read a couple of them. So I learned about the barriers that exist for getting people from diverse backgrounds, professional licensure or credentialing. Now they're really rolling in. And again, we'll share this back. Sometimes it's hard to even fully orient when we have lots of comments. Challenge of integrating disability care, secondary traumatic stress, the importance of community engagement, taking a stance of curiosity when working with kids and families, importance of contextualization and connecting with refugees that are linguistically and culturally appropriate. Attention given to prevention efforts. So again, psychotherapy, psychologists that do one-on-one psychotherapy, and we know that one of the major infrastructure challenges is also, prevention infrastructure that may or may not be delivered by individuals with a formal mental health background. Community-based programming, working with state refugee health coordinators to connect with existing resources. One of the follow-up documents that folks will get is a link, a list of lots of different resources, some that were mentioned today, as well as others, both from our program, from the Boston College program, and then other programs throughout the United States and around the world doing this work. And again, as Dr. Smith mentioned, we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. We can utilize existing frameworks and tool, and then continue to use our creativity and specific location to adapt to help the kids and families we're trying to help directly. So let's go for another minute or two here as folks are putting this in. So centering resources and relationships of migrant and refugee communities in order to promote and bolster culturally sensitive healing. Kurubo alluded to a lot of these in her comments as well, around how do we center cultural brokers, uplift those perspectives, and then scaffold the professional development and sustainability of those folks. TSTR was built in part because there weren't refugee healthcare providers or mental health care providers for the communities that were trying to be served. And so that dialogue model came from that. However, over time, more and more, we want to create systems where the providers are from the community as much as is possible and sustainable. I'll read a couple more here, and then I'll pass it over to Heidi. Yeah, a work in progress that needs continued research, care, and policy. In our group, we've reflected on this like 20 years ago or so. The field, refugee mental health or refugee trauma, was a nascent field. It wasn't really that much there, and how much has grown in the past 2 decades, and how much more needs to be done. And so we need everyone who's on this call. We need you, and we see you, we appreciate you, and we need your innovation, your wisdom, and your work. And maybe we'll end on this comment from a quote from one of the panelists: "Nothing we do is sufficient, but everything we do is important." You all are important, and we appreciate all the work that you do. And so thanks for being here today. And so for some closing comments, I'll pass it over to my colleague Heidi Ellis. And again, take a look out for that link in the chat for the feedback survey. Thanks so much for being here.
All right, thank you so much, Jeff, for passing it over and for this incredibly inspiring conversation that we've been having for the past couple hours, including the Padlet. I love the ideas that are popping up there. I was thinking as people were talking, the title of the panel was about work systems. And, we heard about ways in which systems are not keeping up or not well culturally fit to the needs. And then we heard really heartbreaking conversations around like ways in which systems are part of the problem and how painful some of this post-resettlement time can be, made worse by systems like the asylum application process or systems that simply can't meet people where they need to be met. But then there's this thread of kind of thinking beyond systems and reimagining systems and the incredible kind of glimmers of innovation and real contribution that have been made. And I think, Jeff, you were just saying we've come a long way. And in many ways, I feel like there's two stories to be holding today. And one is like a celebration of how much has been done and the voices now that we're hearing, community partners who are key leaders in this field. And really a growing awareness around the importance of this, the importance of making sure that people who serve communities have understanding, often from inside that community, all of that to be celebrated. And the second story, which is like, we're not done. How do we hold that appreciation for the work that is happening and continue to stretch beyond, innovate beyond, get out of that sort of box that the service systems have put us in when they're failing us and say, we can do better. And what is that? How can we do that together? And I'm just so grateful to all of you who are here today, speaking, listening, because I know you are part of that community of innovation, moving this field forward. So thank you all. Let's keep doing the work. Jeff, is that back to you or Morgan, one of you to close?
Is back to me. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for your wonderful words and for closing us out. And I just wanted to echo the sentiments from today and thank everyone for their great participation. An immense thanks to all of our speakers and the wonderful things that we were able to learn from them. As Jeff mentioned earlier, I put the link in the chat to the feedback form. So if you could take the next couple minutes to please fill out the feedback form, that would be very helpful as we use that to draft up our events for the following years as well. And if you have any remaining questions for the speakers, feel free to put them in the chat as well. We'll be sending follow-up documents touching upon the different themes that we talked about and different resources today, and we will try to address those as well in that document's coming. And we'll also be sending out the recording to everyone who RSVP'd. So thank you all so much again. It was such a great event, and we hope to see you next year. Thank you.